She kissed me after I did what her entire army couldn't. The Veth came from below. That was the part nobody told you in the briefings. You watched the projections of their ships punching through the thermosphere like burning needles, and you spent 3 years building gun platforms in orbit and hardening coastal cities and burying command bunkers under 100 meters of granite. You planned for the sky. You trained for the sky. Every general and admiral and xenostrategist on Earth pointed their models upward and drew their threat vectors in descending lines, because the sky was where the threat had appeared, and the threat had appeared that way because the Veth were very good at directing attention. Nobody looked at the ocean. That was not an accident. Carter Vane understood this later, understood it in the specific, verifiable way that comes from evidence rather than retrospect, but he understood it instinctively earlier, in the first weeks after initial contact, when everyone was looking up and he kept finding himself looking down. The Veth had arrived in a way calculated to produce that response. The atmospheric entry, the city ships visible from the ground on clear nights like slow new moons, the brief and devastating demonstrations of capability in the first exchanges over the Pacific, all of it was designed to establish the sky as the domain of threat. All of it was positioning. It was the oldest tactical principle in existence. Make your enemy look where you want them to look, so they're not looking where you're actually moving. Carter Vane had once. He'd spent 6 years wrangling great whites off the research platforms in the South Pacific, back when the worst thing in the water was still a shark. He had a kind of instinct about deep things, about the pressure they carried, about the patience they could sustain. When the first Veth scout forms surfaced off the Azores in the spring, most people described them as resembling jellyfish. Carter looked at the footage and thought, no, jellyfish drift. These things were holding position in a 4-knot current. That was something else entirely. That was something choosing to be where it was. He'd said as much in a report that traveled up through 2 levels of naval research and died somewhere in the bureaucracy. He didn't blame the bureaucracy. He understood it. When you're watching something the size of a tennis court glow cold blue 300 meters underwater, and your every instinct tells you it's thinking, the human response is to call that instinct wrong. The human brain protects itself from unbearable possibilities by filing them under improbable, and the bureaucracy formalized that instinct into procedure as bureaucracies do. The report was logged. A field note was attached. Someone wrote speculative, insufficient data on it, which was fair. There wasn't enough data. There wasn't enough data because nobody was looking. Carter had made his peace with that. He was not, by disposition, a man who needed to be believed in advance. He needed to be right when it mattered, and he needed to be in the right place when being right would count for something. The rest, the validation, the recognition, the slow institutional machine of acknowledgement, he had long since decided was not his department. His department was the water. He was stationed at Hadal Station Bravo when the war started. The facility sat on a seamount in the North Atlantic, a former submarine refueling platform that had been retrofitted 3 times over into something that was neither quite military nor quite civilian. A research outpost, a listening post, a place to put people and projects that didn't fit anywhere else neatly. The upper decks had been modernized with composite panels and pressurized observation bays that let you look out at 300 meters of dark water without the view killing you. The lower corridors still smelled like the Cold War, rubber seals and industrial lubricant, and the specific mineral patience of seawater that had been working on the same walls for 40 years and hadn't given up. There were 22 people on rotation. Carter had been there 11 months on a contract he kept meaning not to renew. The people were good. That was the thing that kept surprising him 11 months in. Research postings in remote hostile environments tended to sort for a particular kind of person, not the best of their field necessarily, but the most self-contained, the least dependent on approval or proximity, the kind of scientist or technician who needed the work more than they needed the life organized around the work. Carter recognized these people because he was one. He trusted them for the same reason he trusted himself. Not because they were extraordinary, but because they understood that the ocean didn't care about your feelings, and they'd made their adjustments accordingly. He told himself he stayed because the ocean was interesting here. This was true. He also stayed because leaving required a decision, and decisions required certainty, and the ocean never gave you certainty. It gave you information and time if you were patient, and sometimes the information clarified into something you could act on, and you acted, and that was the closest thing to certainty on offer. Contracts renewed themselves if you didn't actively stop them. He hadn't actively stopped this one. He figured he'd get around to it. He was in the wet lab when the alert sounded. Not the general alarm, the deep contact alarm. The one most of the staff had never heard outside of drills. A single long tone, like a foghorn swallowed by the walls. Carter had the presence of mind to grab his dive knife and his emergency rebreather before he was even fully standing. 11 months of living on something that floated 300 meters above a 4-kilometer drop had refined certain reflexes. The central corridor was already half full when he got there. Dr. Maren Solis was at the tactical display, her dark hair loose, her jacket half-buttoned, the way it always was at 3 in the morning. She was the facility's director, xenobiologist by training, operational commander by necessity, and a rather grim appointment process that she had never stopped trying to escape. She looked up when Carter came in, and something in her face made his chest tighten. "Talk to me," he said. 17 contacts at depth, she said, rising, coordinated. She pressed her thumb to a point on the display. "One is directly below us." "One what?" "We don't have a name for them yet. The taxonomy team's been calling them Veth forms, lower caste. They're not the city ships, they're smaller." She pulled up a sonar image. About the size of a subway car, each one. Carter studied the image, elongated, hydrodynamic, moving in formation. "That's a flanking pattern," he said. "I know. They're not rising to the surface." "No," she met his eyes, "they're coming here." The next 4 minutes were the kind that rearranged your relationship with time. Carter got the non-essential personnel moving toward the emergency compression tubes, the facility's only reliable escape path in a deep contact scenario. He got Brex, the senior engineer, working on the internal blast doors. He got a weapons status from the surface platform above them and received the answer he expected. The surface turrets were configured for aerial contact, not subsurface. Someone had locked the firing parameters months ago, and nobody had changed them because nobody had planned for this. He was still trying to unlock the firing parameters when the first impact hit. It wasn't an explosion. It was more like being inside a drum someone had struck with the flat of a very large hand. The walls flexed. Lights flickered. 2 of the wall-mounted monitors cracked and went dark. From below, somewhere deep in the facility's infrastructure, came a sound like steel under sustained pressure, a long, groaning note that Carter felt in his back teeth. "Structural contact," Brex reported, his voice very flat. "Lower junction. They're not punching through there." He hesitated. "They're pressing, like they're learning the shape of it." "Intelligence assessment?" Carter asked. "They're probing for weak points." "I know what they're doing. I'm asking how smart they are." Maren answered from across the room. "Smart enough to know they should come from below. Smart enough to know we weren't ready." She was pulling emergency power feeds off the backup grid, rerouting them to the internal sensors. She worked with a kind of compressed fury, not panicked, just denied the outcome she wanted, which Carter had come to recognize as her particular mode of stress. The orbital platforms hit a Veth city ship 3 days ago. Direct kinetic strike. The city ship shrugged it off and moved to a new position. These are something else, more agile, more specific. "Probes," Carter said. "Weapons, but thinking weapons." She looked up. "Carter, I need to tell you something." "Tell me while we work." She came to stand beside him. She was not by habit a person who stood close to people when she talked. It registered. "The research we've been doing here," she said. "The enzyme sequencing work, it's not Alzheimer's research. It was never Alzheimer's research. That was the cover." She watched him absorb this. "We've been mapping Veth biochemistry. We got samples from the first contact site, the Azores. We've been trying to understand how they communicate, how they coordinate the work. It was going well. We thought we had another 6 months." Carter said nothing for a moment. He was still routing power. His hands were steady. "So they know we're here," he said. "Yes." "And they know what we know." "We think so, yes." He nodded slowly. "That's the mission then." "What?" "Getting the data out. That's what we're actually here to do now." He finally got a response from the surface turret controls, locked, as he'd feared, but there was a manual override on the platform deck above. He could get to it. He filed that away. "How many people can we get to the compression tubes in the next 10 minutes? 15, maybe. 7 of the lab staff are in the lower tier. The blast doors are already." Another impact. This one was different, not a press but a puncture. A short, violent shock that came from the port side. Somewhere below, a pressure seal failed with a sound like a gunshot, and Carter heard water, the specific sound of water moving somewhere it shouldn't, fast and purposeful. Then the lights went out completely. The emergency strips came on, a thin red line running along the floor of each corridor, enough to move by. Carter was already moving. He had the layout of the facility memorized, not because he was methodical by nature, but because he was the kind of person who imagined exits. Every room he'd ever occupied, he knew where the exits were. This had served him poorly at parties and excellently everywhere else. He found Brex in the engineering corridor, working by flashlight. The blast doors to the lower tier were sealed. 7 people down there, Carter said. "I know." Brex didn't look up. He was working a manual release panel with a wrench and something approximating prayer. "Door control is in the lower tier. They might be able to." The intercom crackled. A voice, DOS, one of the lab techs, came through in fragments. "Water in corridor 3, maybe a meter. We sealed sublab 4, but static. 2 of them, I can see them through the viewport there." The static swallowed the rest. Carter took the wrench from Brex. It took him 6 minutes to manually cycle the blast door. He braced against the wall and used his whole body, not just his arms, remembering something an old dive instructor had told him once about leverage, that the body is always stronger than the arm believes, that most limits are in the mind and only a few are in the bone. The door moved. Not easily, not quickly, but it moved. The corridor below was thigh-deep in seawater. Cold. The facility's heating coils were in the lower tier, and without power they'd lost their battle with the North Atlantic. Carter went in without hesitation. The cold hit him like a physical thing, not just temperature but weight, the water pressing against him with a kind of insistence that was almost personal. He found DOS and 2 others huddled in Sublab 4. The other 4 had made it to the emergency ladders on the far end. He got DOS's group moving, keeping them against the wall away from the viewport. Because there were things visible through the viewport, shifting blue-cold shapes in the dark water outside, and he did not want anyone stopping to look at them. One person stopped to look. Her name was Fen, a structural engineer, 28 years old. She pressed her face to the reinforced glass and stared at the shape on the other side, and what she said, very quietly, was, "It's looking at me." Carter took her arm and kept her moving. "Looking is fine," he said, "just don't look back." He had no real basis for that advice. He said it because it was the kind of thing that kept people moving. Getting the 7 back up through the blast door took another 11 minutes. Carter went through last. The water was chest-high by then. He pulled himself up through the door gap, got his feet clear, and felt the deep structural groan of the facility redouble, a long, shuddering complaint from somewhere in the Foundation stanchions. The Veth were still pressing. They were learning. He found Marin in the central hub, alone, working by the light of a portable power cell. She had pulled up everything she could on the local hard system, the biochemistry data, the coordination mapping, the sequencing work. She was compressing it onto a physical drive, her fingers fast and precise. 14 people in the compression tubes, she said without looking up, ready to ascend on your signal. I need 4 more minutes. You'll have 3, Carter said. Where's Preacher? Kitchen, I think. SGT. Marcus Preacher. Hollowell was the facility's security liaison, officially. Unofficially, he was the kind of man facilities like this kept around because when things went wrong, they tended to go wrong in ways that required someone willing to do ugly math quickly. He was also, somewhat incongruously, deeply religious, and he carried a heavy silver crucifix on a chain around his neck, and he had once, during a slow week, delivered a 40-minute exegesis on the Book of Job to anyone who would listen. Carter had listened. He found it relevant. He found Preacher in the kitchen, not praying, but standing on the counter above a meter of water, holding a parrot named Galileo on one shoulder and a flare gun in the opposite hand, watching a Veth form move past the kitchen's reinforced porthole with the expression of a man who has made his peace with things and would like events to be aware of this. I was wondering when you'd show up, Preacher said. How long has it been there? 2 minutes circling, Preacher watched it. The shape beyond the glass was moving slowly, methodically, not attacking, not retreating, coming around to the same point, pausing, moving on. It knows the door is here. It's found the weak point in the external skin, and it's considering what to do about it. How do you know it's considering anything? Because a dumb animal would have hit it already. Preacher stepped down from the counter, water coming up to his thighs. Galileo fluffed his feathers in protest and made a sound that communicated his position on the situation clearly. Dumb animals act on impulse. Smart ones plan. The problem with smart ones is that they're also patient ones. A dumb thing hits the door and either gets through or doesn't. A smart thing circles until it understands the door, and then it chooses when to hit it. He handed Carter the flare gun. Take this. I've got something better. What Preacher had was a jury-rigged electrical relay he'd built from the kitchen's industrial induction plates and a length of marine cable. The kind of improvised engineering that would make a trained electrician wince and a desperate man breathe slowly and hope for the best. He had it laid along the floor of the kitchen, below the water line, running out toward the external access panel beneath the porthole. The induction plates were resting flat on the submerged floor, connected by marine cable to a manual discharge switch Preacher had fashioned from a circuit breaker and what appeared to be the handle of a pot. Conductive water, conductive hull section, Preacher said almost cheerfully. I send current through that. Anything in contact with the external skin in that zone gets enough voltage to confuse even a smart thing. Disrupt its sensory apparatus. Make it feel like the environment itself has turned hostile, which is the kind of message that doesn't need translation. You could blow a hole in the hull. I could, but the current path runs along the bottom, and the hull section it contacts is a secondary plate, 3 centimeters of steel between us and the ocean, and the current needs to find a path of lower resistance. He considered for a moment honestly, with the careful expression of a man doing real math. I don't think I will, probably. Carter looked at the shape beyond the porthole. It had stopped circling. It was still now. In the dim water outside, it was hard to make out precisely. A blue-cold luminescence, edges that suggested rather than defined a body, something like a head that wasn't quite a head oriented in their direction. The faint patterned movement of its bioluminescence, cycling through something that might have been data and might have been mood, and was almost certainly both. He thought of all the times he'd been in the water with great whites. The way they held position in a current with almost no visible effort, their whole body, a single continuous accommodation to the forces around them. The way they assessed, not with eyes exactly, not with sight alone, but with a full-body reading of pressure and chemistry and electrical field that made the space they occupied continuous with the space you occupied, made the boundary between them and their environment something different than it was for you. People thought sharks were mindless. People were wrong about that. The difference was that a shark assessed you as food, as a problem with a caloric solution. What was behind that porthole was assessing something more complicated. It was assessing the door. "Do it," Carter said. The discharge was brief and violent. The kitchen lights, on emergency power, surged and dimmed. The water hummed in a frequency Carter felt in his teeth. Through the porthole, the shape convulsed, a full-body shudder that traveled the length of it from what might have been head to what might have been tail, the bioluminescence stuttering between cold blue and a harsh yellow-white, irregular, chaotic. Then it retreated. Not dead, he could see it still moving, still coordinated in the basic sense, but retreating, moving back into the dark water, back into the cold, back into the cluster of shapes that ghosted at the edge of the porthole light, rejoining them, sending something into their chemistry. "Good," Carter said. "Yes," said Preacher, "but there are 16 more of them." He looked at Carter with the even, diagnostic expression he used when he was being honest about the odds. "What's the plan?" "The plan is upward," Carter said. "Get everyone to the compression tubes. Once we're on the surface platform, I have something." "Does it involve that manual turret override you've been calculating in the back of your head for the last 20 minutes? Carter looked at him. "I've been watching your eyes," Preacher said simply. "You get a specific look when you're working a mechanical problem, more focused on nothing in particular, like you're reading something nobody else can see." He reached down and pulled Galileo off his shoulder, settling the parrot more securely. "Lead the way." The ascent through the compression tubes was supposed to take 8 minutes. It took 23. The tubes ran vertically from the facility's emergency deck up through 300 meters of water to the surface platform above. They were wide enough for 2 people abreast, reinforced, pressure-rated to depth. In a working facility, they flooded in sequence, equalized, and rose. In a facility with its power systems failing, and its hull being systematically probed by alien entities with a demonstrated understanding of structural weak points, they did something else. They flooded in the wrong order. They equalized at the wrong pressure. And the door seals at the midpoint junction held when they should have released and released when they should have held. Carter went through the midpoint junction by hand. He could describe the process if pressed. The equalization valve, the seal release, the moment when the column of water above him became accessible and the current from below tried to push him back. He could describe it. He chose not to think about it. He came up through the surface platform hatch into gray dawn, cold wind, and the smell of the North Atlantic, salt and iron, and something underneath it that was new, biological, faintly sweet in a way that turned his stomach. All 14 survivors were on the platform deck, dripping, staring at the horizon. There were shapes in the water, a dozen of them at least, circular disturbances on the surface, rings of disturbed water that marked where the Veth forms were rising, holding just below the chop, considering the platform, considering the people on it. Marin was there, the drive in her hand, her hair plastered to her face. She looked at Carter with an expression he couldn't immediately read. "Signal out?" he asked. "One burst," she said. "Before I left the hub, I don't know if it got through." "Then we behave as if it didn't." Carter looked at the shapes in the water. He looked at the surface turrets, 4 of them, bolted to the platform's corners, squat and capable and pointing at the sky. He'd known about the locked firing parameters for 20 minutes. He'd been working the problem since then. There was a manual control panel on the turret mast itself, Old Navy, built back when electronic locks were a new idea and engineers still put physical overrides on everything because they didn't entirely trust the locks. He could see the panel from here. He could reach it. He also knew what the Veth forms were doing. He'd been thinking about it since Marin's corridor, since she'd told him about the research, since the picture had assembled itself in the part of his mind that he used for reading deep water. They'd flooded the facility, not to destroy it, to displace the people in it, to drive the survivors upward to the surface, where the pressure differential and the structural constraints of an exposed platform would limit their options, where 14 people standing on a deck above open water would be in a fundamentally worse defensive position than the same 14 people inside a hardened underwater structure. The flooding was the tactic. The platform was the kill box. The Veth thought in systems. They thought in outcomes. They were extraordinarily good at engineering situations. They were perhaps slightly less good at predicting what human beings would do when they understood the situation. Because understanding a situation and then operating anyway, even against the odds, was a specifically human pathology that the Veth appeared to have failed to model. Carter understood the situation. "Get everyone to the center of the platform," he told Marin. "Away from the edge rails. Whatever happens in the next few minutes, nobody goes in the water voluntarily." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to get the turrets working. The fire parameters are locked to aerial. The fire parameters are locked electronically. The turrets themselves aren't." He was already moving toward the mast. Navy installed manual traverse and elevation controls in 1987. Nobody updated the hardware when they updated the software. The lock is in the targeting computer. The barrel can still move. You can't aim manually at moving subsurface targets. The ballistics alone. "I don't need to hit them," Carter said. "I need to make them think I can." He climbed the mast in the wind with his hands, and the particular economy of motion that meant he wasn't going to think about whether the rungs were rated for this, whether the platform was structurally sound, whether the shapes in the water below him were watching or not. He had long since learned to have two tracks in his mind, the one that ran the problem and the one that ran the fear, and to simply not give the second track any energy while the first one needed it. The manual control panel was exactly where he expected it, a steel box, riveted, painted navy gray, with a lock that yielded to a tool from his dive kit in under a minute. Inside, two handles, a bubble level, a range dial graduated in 50-meter increments, manual traverse, manual elevation. He could point these guns anywhere he wanted. What he did, and he had to be honest with himself about how little of it was science, and how much was simply reading the water the way he'd been reading water for 15 years, was watch the rings, the disturbance patterns. He watched where they clustered and where they thinned, where the shapes below were closest to the surface and where they held deeper. He watched the way they were oriented, not randomly, not like animals milling, but with a coherence that had a shape to it, a geometry. He'd seen this before, in the holding pens, in the circling patterns of sharks before a coordinated push. There was a center, not a geographic center, a decisional center, a point in the pattern where the information was flowing toward, where the coordination was originating. He'd learned to read it from animals that were primitive compared to what was in the water below him now, but the principle was the same. Collective intelligence still has a point of densest signal, a place where the thing that knows what to do is located. He elevated the southwest turret. He traversed it 43 degrees from its locked position. He dropped the barrel to 7 degrees below horizontal. He fired. The turret was rated for aerial targets. The ammunition was not remotely designed for what he was attempting. What came out was not a surgical strike. It was a column of violent displacement, water erupting, the surface of the ocean breaking apart in a 30-meter radius directly over the center of the pattern. Sound and pressure and shock, traveling down through water that conducts all three things exceptionally well. The rings changed. He watched them change. The geometry dissolved suddenly all at once, Not the way a formation breaks when it's disrupted from outside, but the way a sentence breaks when you remove the subject. The coherence was gone. The shapes were still there, still moving, but without the shape of intention. They'd lost the point of densest signal. Whatever lived at the center of that pattern had been removed, and the pattern had collapsed with it. Not destroyed. He hadn't destroyed them. He wasn't under any illusions about that. But the coordinated assault on the platform, the kill box operation, the careful system they'd built over the last hour, it was gone. The Veth forms were moving in confusion now, reorganizing. That took time. That took enough time. The rescue aircraft came from the northwest 17 minutes later. Carter was still on the mast when they arrived. He came down slowly, his hands stiff from the cold and the grip. Marin was at the base of the mast, which surprised him. He'd told her to stay at the center of the platform. She was looking up at him as he climbed down, and she had an expression he still couldn't read, and he was about to ask her what was wrong when she put her hand on his face and kissed him. It was brief. It was specific. It was the kind of thing that happens when relief and gratitude and 3 years of professional distance all arrive at the same moment and can't find any other expression. He stood on the last rung of the mast ladder, 1 foot still above the platform deck, her hand against his jaw. Wind and cold and the smell of the ocean. In the water below them, the shapes were still moving, but moving away, the rings spreading and dissipating. The whole Pacific 7th Fleet has been trying to break a Veth formation for 8 months, she said. I heard. How did you know to do that? How did you know where the center was? He looked at the water, at the patterns that were even now fading, going quiet, the ocean returning to what it pretended to be, just water, just depth, just the old blue dark. I spent a long time in the water with things that think, he said. Not as well as these, but the shape of it's the same. He stepped down onto the deck. Collective intelligence has a leader, even when it looks like it doesn't. The leader doesn't always look like a leader. Sometimes it looks like just another point in the pattern, but the pattern orbits it. You learn to read the orbit. She took her hand from his face. She looked at him steadily. I'm going to need you to write all of that down, she said. Formally, everything you just told me. I know. Tactical intelligence on Veth formation behavior, observational methodology, practical application under field conditions. She was already organizing it. He could tell, turning it from a moment into a document, from something that had happened on a mast in the wind into something that could be transmitted and replicated and built upon. She was a scientist. This was how she survived things. The implications for the orbital platforms alone. Marin. She stopped. I know, he said. We'll write it down, all of it, but can you give me 2 minutes first? She considered this with the particular expression of someone who has been granting herself no concessions for a very long time and has become suspicious of them. Then she said, 2 minutes, and she stood beside him at the rail, and they looked at the ocean together. The rescue craft was getting closer. You could hear the rotors now, underneath the wind. Preacher came to stand on Carter's other side. Galileo was still on his shoulder, apparently unperturbed by everything. Preacher looked at the water, looked at the retreating shapes in it, and said nothing for a while. Then he said, Brothers never make it out of situations like this. Carter looked at him. That's what I used to think, Preacher said. He touched the crucifix at his collar. I'm revising my priors. The drive that Marin had pulled from the station contained 11 months of Veth biochemistry research, the enzyme sequencing data, the coordination mapping, 83 megabytes of work that represented the only systematic study of Veth communication biology that existed anywhere in human hands, built, quietly and without announcement, by 22 people on a platform in the North Atlantic who had been lying officially about what they were doing there. They got it out. Das's laptop, sealed in its dry bag and held above her head, while she stood in chest-deep water in a flooding corridor at 3 in the morning, held a secondary backup of the sequencing files that turned out to be critical when the main drive proved partially corrupted during the ascent. Das was 24. She'd made the backup not because anyone told her to, but because she was the kind of person who made backups as a reflex. The same way she double-checked her equipment and cross-referenced her results, and generally operated on the assumption that the world would find a way to test the thing you'd neglected. Carter thought about this later, the specific texture of it, the young scientist holding her laptop above her head in the flooding corridor, making sure the data didn't die with the station. He thought about it because it was a precise instance of something he didn't have clean language for. The human habit of protecting the future even when the present is actively trying to kill you. The Veth, for all their distributed intelligence and ancient tactical sophistication, had not modeled for DOS. They had not modeled for the laptop in the dry bag. They had modeled for the station and the research and the people, but they had not modeled for the specific stubbornness of a 24-year-old scientist who had spent 11 months building something and was not going to let it sink. This is the part Carter told rarely, because it was the part that required him to explain things he didn't entirely understand himself. The part that required him to explain the reed, the feel of water, the shape of collective motion, the place where a school of animals becomes a mind, and the place where that mind has its center. The part that required him to explain why he'd spent 15 years in the ocean with dangerous things, and what exactly he'd been learning in all that time, when most people had concluded he was just doing the same job over and over. He explained it in the debrief 2 days later in a room full of people with significantly more rank than him. He sat at a table and he said, "You've been thinking about the Veth as technology, as a military problem, as something to be shot at and blown up and driven back. That framework is not wrong, but it is incomplete. What the Veth did at Bravo Station was not an assault. It was reasoning. They read our defensive posture, identified the assumptions built into it, and engineered a scenario that made our defense work against itself. They did this collectively, cooperatively, with a kind of fluid tactical intelligence that your current models don't account for because your current models were designed to fight things that operate on command structures you recognize." He said, "The Veth don't have a command structure you recognize. They have something older, something that lives in chemistry instead of language. Something that feels from the outside like instinct but operates from the inside like consensus at speeds you can't interrupt. I know what that kind of intelligence looks like in the water. I know how to find its center. I can teach you to find it too." There was a long silence after that. The senior admiral in the room looked at him for a while, and Carter could see the man doing the same thing Carter had done on the mast, running 2 tracks simultaneously, one that evaluated the content, and one that evaluated the implausibility of the person delivering it. A shark wrangler telling a room full of admirals and generals that he knew something about alien military coordination that their entire analytical apparatus had missed. He could see the admiral deciding which track to give the energy to. He knew what the decision felt like from the inside. He'd made it himself, plenty of times in the water. "You're a shark wrangler," the admiral said. "Yes," Carter said, "that's exactly right." Another silence. "All right," the admiral said, "start talking." The next 18 months were strange. Carter had never wanted to be important. He had, in fact, structured his entire adult life around a kind of productive obscurity. The remote platform, the contractual ambiguity, the work that mattered without requiring him to be the kind of person who sat in rooms and made decisions that had consequences measured in other people's lives. The ocean had suited him because it was indifferent to biography. A shark did not care what you'd done before or what you intended to do afterward. It cared only what you were doing now, in the water, in the present moment where everything that mattered was happening. Carter had always preferred that kind of feedback. It was honest in a way that most human feedback wasn't. The Veth were not sharks, but the principle applied. The ocean's indifference had trained him in exactly the kind of situational reading that the next year required. The ability to process what was actually in front of him rather than what he expected to find. The ability to hold observations without immediately forcing them into familiar categories. The ability to wait for the shape of a thing to show itself rather than imposing the shape he was looking for. The next year required this constantly and urgently, and in circumstances he had not designed and could not control. He built a methodology. He called it formation reading, which was not a very impressive name, and the military renamed it collective adversarial pattern analysis, which was more impressive and meant exactly the same thing. It was the science of finding the center of a distributed intelligence system, the point of densest signal, the node that the pattern orbited, the place where coordination originated and from which, if removed, the coherence collapsed. He developed it from his own observational practice, cross-referenced against Marin's biochemistry data and Das's chemical pathway work, tested against historical Veth formation data going back to the first Azores contact. He ran the training program. He sat in briefing rooms and on helicopter decks and in the back of strike submarines and showed people how to read the water. It was not easy to teach. The core of it was not a technique. It was a disposition, a way of looking that took time to develop, that required you to unlearn some fundamental habits of military training. Military training taught you to identify threat and respond. Formation reading required you to watch without responding, to resist the instinct to act on what you saw until you had seen enough to understand not just what was happening, but why, what the pattern was organized around, where the weight of it was, what it would do if its center were removed. It required patience, which was not a quality the military's training architecture had historically prioritized. Some people got it quickly, usually the ones who had spent time in environments where the feedback was immediate and physical and indifferent, the divers, the field researchers, the combat veterans who had learned in the specific school of things going wrong faster than any plan could account for. Others learned the mechanical application of the methodology, and that was useful too, imperfect, but better than nothing. Better than the previous 4 years of trying to fight a collective intelligence with tools designed for hierarchical ones. Marin led the biochemistry work. The enzyme data from Bravo Station proved that Veth coordination was not electromagnetic, not radio, not any wave propagation they'd previously tested for. It was chemical, dissolved compounds, minute concentrations, read by a sensory apparatus that the Veth forms carried in their forward surface tissue. They talked the way a river talks to the shore, continuously, in chemistry, in the actual physical exchange of substance. This had implications. These implications were not small. The first practical application was a masking compound that disrupted Veth chemical communication within a 40-meter radius. It was, by military standards, a modest weapon. It didn't destroy anything, didn't damage anything, didn't even significantly deter anything. It just made a small area opaque to the chemistry that Veth used to coordinate. The first time they used it in a genuine engagement, a Veth formation assault on a mid-Pacific relay station, 9 months after Bravo, the formation dissolved. Not all of it, not permanently. But the center couldn't read the edges, and the edges couldn't read the center, and the beautiful, terrible coherence of a Veth formation, the thing that made them nearly unstoppable, broke apart like a sentence with the subject removed. Carter wasn't there. He heard about it afterward, in an after-action report that was more clinical than the thing deserved. What he was, when he heard, was sitting on the deck of a research vessel in the North Atlantic, looking at the water. Marin came and sat beside him. She had a thermos of coffee and the particular look of someone who has been doing math for 16 consecutive hours and has arrived at an answer they weren't expecting. The relay station data confirms the formation read model, she said. 91% accuracy on center identification. The masking compound worked exactly as the model predicted. Good, Carter said. 14 Veth forms retreated without engaging. She poured coffee into the thermos cap and handed it to him. 2 months ago, a formation that size would have taken the station apart in 20 minutes. I know. You know what I keep thinking about. She looked at the water with him. You know what I keep thinking about when I look at the data. What? The Veth spent 4 years engineering that formation behavior, building the chemical communication, the distributed coordination, the flanking tactics. It's extraordinarily sophisticated. It worked on everything we threw at it for 4 years. She was quiet for a moment, and it stopped working the moment someone who had spent 15 years reading the water actually looked at it. Carter said nothing. The Veth made one miscalculation, Marin said. They modeled human military behavior correctly. They modeled human technology correctly. What they didn't model is stubbornness, Carter said. She looked at him. Not intelligence, he said, not technology. Just the particular human refusal to accept the situation you've been put in and work within it. The thing where you look at the walls and instead of thinking about how to survive inside them, you think about how to take them apart. He drank the coffee. It was terrible. He drank it anyway. The Veth engineered a perfect trap. The trap worked perfectly. The thing they didn't account for is that some people, when you put them in a perfect trap, spend the whole time figuring out where you're standing when you set it. Marin thought about this. That's what I needed you to say, she said. I've been trying to write the theoretical framework for the new training protocols, and I couldn't find the right language. Don't use my language. It's too informal. I like your language. He handed the thermos cap back. Below them, the water was dark and cold and moving with its own purposes, the same as it had always been. Somewhere far below, deeper than the research vessel's sonar could resolve, there were things moving, patient things, intelligent things, things that had been planning since before any human being had any idea what was happening. But they were things that had made an assumption about the humans they were planning against. That assumption was wrong. Wrong in a way so specific, so particular to the human capacity for stubborn situational refusal, that it wasn't correctable, not quickly, not without fundamentally misunderstanding what they were dealing with. They thought the humans would work within the limits of what existed. They didn't know about the people who read the orbit. Carter knew one other thing, something he'd understood in the moment on the mast, in the specific second between firing and watching the pattern dissolve. He hadn't understood it consciously then, not in words, but he'd carried it since, and it had resolved into words over the following months. The Veth were an old intelligence. Ancient, probably. They had been doing this, the coordinated pressure, the systematic reading of defensive posture, the engineered kill boxes, for a very long time, against a very large number of opponents. Their tactics were refined because they'd been refined against real adversaries over real time, opponents who tried all the obvious things and lost. The formation behavior wasn't elegant because the Veth were clever. It was elegant because everything inelegant had been selected out by experience. What the Veth had never encountered in all that time was a species that learned from its losses faster than the Veth could adjust. A species that took a defeat and used it as data immediately and came back with something new before the adjustment cycle was complete. It wasn't that humans were smarter. It was that humans were catastrophically bad at accepting that a problem couldn't be solved, and catastrophically good at making use of the 15 minutes they had while they were waiting to figure out how. This was, by any measure, an absurd advantage. Carter put it in the report, formally, with the right language, in the document that Marin had asked for. He put it in words that were appropriate for a classified technical assessment. He made it clear and specific and actionable. What he didn't put in the report, what lived outside the formal record, in the part of his mind that he used for the things that were true but not transferable, was the simpler version. The version he'd arrived at on the mast, in the cold, with the shapes moving below him and the rotors coming from the northwest. They thought they had us, they were right. And we did it anyway. In the spring following Bravo Station, the first Veth formation was fully disrupted in open ocean engagement. In the summer, the Pacific 7th Fleet, the same fleet that had spent 8 months failing to break a Veth formation, successfully identified and neutralized a coordination center using the formation reading methodology Carter had developed. In the fall, the biochemistry team published the full chemical communication map, and 3 separate research groups began working on second-generation masking compounds. In the winter, the Veth City ships, which had been advancing steadily since the initial contact, stopped advancing. They didn't retreat. They held position. Their reasons for holding position were the subject of considerable debate in the briefing rooms and the intelligence assessments, and Carter participated in some of those debates and declined others. He declined the ones that were primarily about whether the Veth were beaten, because that question was wrong. He participated in the ones that asked what the Veth were doing instead. His own reading of it was this: the Veth were not holding position because they were beaten. They were holding position because they were doing what intelligent things do when a fundamental assumption breaks. They were revising their model. They had operated for possibly centuries, possibly longer, on the assumption that their formation behavior was, in practical terms, unbreakable. That the chemical communication, the distributed coordination, the flanking geometry they had refined against every adversary they'd ever met was a solved problem, a perfected system. They had built their entire approach to conflict around that assumption. When the assumption broke, they didn't have an immediate replacement. They needed time. That would take them a while. The revised model would be better. The next engagement would be harder. Carter said this in every briefing room that would have him. He said it clearly and without comfort, and without the small mercy of qualifying it as speculation. He'd been speculative when nobody wanted to listen. Now they were listening, and now was not the time for speculation. Now was the time for the kind of honesty that was difficult to hear and necessary to act on. He said, "They are not afraid of us. They are recalibrating. There is a difference. Fear means retreat. Recalibration means the next thing they try will have accounted for everything the last thing didn't. Plan accordingly. Use the time." He said, "The masking compound is a first-generation tool. It works against their current communication architecture. They will modify the architecture. We need second-generation and third-generation tools ready before they do. We need to be ahead of the recalibration cycle, not behind it." The admiral who had once called him a shark wrangler with some incredulity now called him a shark wrangler with something closer to affection, which was not the same thing but was an improvement. The admiral listened. The planning shifted. Carter didn't know if the shift was enough. Nobody could know that yet. But it was based on the right question, which was progress. Marin called him, on a Monday in November, from her lab in the reconfigured research vessel that was now technically a naval asset, but still smelled like the North Atlantic. "I have something," she said. "Talk to me." "The third-generation sequencing data. We've been mapping the Veth biochemistry at the cellular level, trying to understand the communication pathway more precisely." Her voice had a particular quality, the compressed fury mode, but running fast, running forward instead of inward. "We found something in the large-form tissue. In the city ships. Carter, we found the protein." "The protein." "The one that started all of this. The one we were supposedly looking for in the first place. The Alzheimer's protein. It exists. In Veth large-form tissue, it exists in concentrations we've never seen in any Earth biochemistry. And it's not just there. It's functional. It's active. It's doing something in the Veth cellular architecture that's analogous to what we thought it could do in human neurons, except..." She stopped. "Marin." "Except it works. In the VETH, it works, and the structural pathway for it is, I need 3 months and then I'll know if it can be adapted. He sat with this. So there's a chance, he said. There is a chance, she said, that the thing we were lying about, the cover story we were using, might actually be real, might actually be there. He thought about Dr. Jim Whitlock, the original biochemist who'd started the research, who'd been transferred off Bravo Station 8 months before the VETH came. He thought about the cover story and the real story, and the strange way the two had run parallel for 11 months before colliding. Write it up, he said, all of it. I already am. A pause. Carter. Yeah. The work you did at Bravo, the formation read, the mast. All of it. Another pause, different from the first. It didn't just help at the relay station. The data from that engagement changed the entire tactical framework. Command restructured the Pacific defense posture around it. 3 stations that would have been hit last month weren't hit. She was quiet for a moment. I thought you should know the number. What number? The estimate of the people who are alive because the formation didn't go the way the VETH planned it. A beat. It's not a small number, Carter. He looked out at the water. Gray sky, white chop, the ocean doing what it always did, moving, indifferent, carrying everything on its surface and hiding everything below. Okay, he said. That's all you're going to say. What else is there to say? Most people would say something more. I'm not most people. No, Marin said, that is extremely accurate. And then, because she was also not most people, get some sleep. We have a briefing at 6. He got some sleep. He dreamed about the water as he often did, the specific quality of deep water, dark, the way light behaved at depth, the patience of the things that lived there. In the dream, the shapes were present but not threatening. They were simply moving as they always moved, as they'd been moving since long before any human being swam their first stroke. Patient, purposeful, old beyond any meaningful reckoning. They moved the way deep things move, with the particular unhurriedness of entities that have never needed to rush, that have always had time, that understand time differently than surface creatures do. Carter moved through the dream the way he moved through the water when work was going well. Not fighting it, not performing for it, just present in it, reading it. In the dream, he could read the pattern clearly. He knew where the center was. He woke before the alarm in the dark to the sound of the ocean against the hull. He lay still for a moment, listening to it. The same sound it had always made. The same sound it had been making for longer than there were ears to hear it. The water moving against whatever was in its way, patient and indifferent and continuous, wearing things down by being exactly what it was and never being anything else. He had always found this sound clarifying rather than unsettling. The ocean was the oldest thing he knew, and it had no opinion about him, and it would be doing this exact same thing long after everything he'd built, and everything he'd broken down had settled into sediment at the bottom of it. He thought about the VETH. He thought about them the way he'd been trained by 15 years of work to think about the things in the water, not with fear and not with contempt, but with the specific attentiveness of someone whose survival depended on accurate understanding. He tried to know them the way he'd learned to know the sharks, not as enemies exactly, not as problems exactly, but as presences with their own coherent logic, their own evolved responses, their own ancient relationship with the environment he was moving through. He thought about what Marin had said, the protein, the thing that was real after all, hiding inside the cover story, waiting to be found inside the biology of the thing they were fighting. He thought about the 11 months of research that had been built on a lie and had produced, by accident or by providence or simply by the irreducible stubbornness of real scientists doing real work, something true. He thought about Das with her laptop above her head in the flooding corridor. He thought about Preacher revising his priors. He thought about the kiss, briefly, and then not at all. In the disciplined way he'd learned to handle things that required more room than he currently had to give them. He got up, he got dressed. He made coffee from the machine in the galley that produced coffee that tasted like the machine had tried its best under difficult circumstances, and he drank it standing at the porthole, looking at the ocean in the gray pre-dawn, the same ocean that had taught him everything he knew, the same ocean that was still, beneath all of this, doing what it had always done. In a few hours he had a briefing. After the briefing, he had a training session with the latest cohort of formation readers, 6 Navy officers and 2 xenobiologists and 1 Marine researcher who had never been in a combat situation and was going to be, Carter thought, the best of the group. After the training session, he had another briefing. After that, probably another. This was what the next year looked like. Briefings and training, and the steady methodical work of converting what he knew into something transferable, something that could outlast him, something that could still be applied after the Veth finished recalibrating and came back with something he hadn't anticipated. He wasn't naive about that. He wasn't planning to be naive about it. They would come back and the next thing would be harder, and some of the people he was training would face it, and some of them would not survive it, and the work would continue past all of them, as work does. That was the contract. He hadn't sought it and he hadn't expected it, and he wasn't going to pretend it was something other than what it was. But he also wasn't going to pretend the last 18 months hadn't happened. He wasn't going to pretend that the formation hadn't broken, that the relay station hadn't held, that the fleet hadn't restructured around a methodology developed by a shark wrangler on a mast in the North Atlantic wind. He wasn't going to pretend that Marin hadn't found the protein, or that Das hadn't held the laptop above her head, or that Preacher hadn't revised his priors. The Veth were old and patient and extraordinarily intelligent, and they had been at this for longer than human civilization had existed. They had never before fought something that learned faster than they could adjust. That was still true. That was still, in whatever came next, the only real advantage humanity had. It was enough. It had been enough before. Carter stood at the porthole with his terrible coffee, looking at the water, and he believed it would be enough again, not because he was optimistic by nature, but because he had spent 15 years in the ocean with things that could kill him, and he had learned with evidence that stubbornness in the face of things that could kill you was a specific kind of weapon. Unelegant, unglamorous, not the kind of thing that looked impressive in a briefing room or a history book, but real, verifiable working. He set down the cup, he went to work. There was still a lot of it to do.